Well, hello, hello, ACUHO-I. Good afternoon. I believe in most parts of the US, we're still in the afternoon. It could be good morning, depending on where you're zooming in from.
Yeah.
Welcome to this episode of our free webinar series. I hope that some of you have attended more than one of these. You'll find them available throughout the month. We started that back up this year. Have had several successful sessions already and still more to come. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about your own professional development in the coming weeks. You can find all of this information via the ACUHO-I website in the upcoming events section. You'll see that logo for the webinar series, and feel free to register and view and share all of the great content that we have coming up. So with that said, I'm going to turn things over to today's presenter. This is Cheryl Bergstaller, and she is going to share with you more about building inclusive campus housing practices upon a universal design framework. Cheryl?
Well, thank you. Very happy to join you. One of the things that I get excited about is the application of the universal design as an approach for pretty much making everything more inclusive of people with disabilities and other people as well. And housing practices is a really good application because it uses all types of principles of universal design because it covers technology that you might be using, like your website, physical access, of course, programmatic access, even access regarding presentations like this one today that I'll make some comments on along the way and how I've made it accessible to people in this group. For instance, just a quick one, I don't assume that everyone can see my screen. And so you'll notice I will speak content that I think is most relevant. I won't always describe a visual if it's just sort of decorative, but you should be able to follow this total presentation in your car with the visuals turned off. And that's because you don't have to request an accommodation if you are blind or have other limitations. I just assume that there'll be a broad audience and that there'll be someone there that's not watching the screen. And then I don't have to worry about it. So I'm Cheryl Bergstaller, and I'm an affiliate professor at the University of Washington and City University of New York. I recently retired from the University of Washington after 40 years, and my major role over the years was accessible technology services. Very much involved in the universal design of campus offerings throughout the campus. Started the Do It program, Disabilities, Opportunities, Internetworking, and Technology, which is grant funded and provides resources, but also a lot of interaction with people around the country and around the world, actually. We have a Do It center in Japan, for example, at the University of Tokyo. And, just trying to spread the word about making things inclusive with a real proactive approach, rather than waiting for a person with a disability to have to step up and say, I can't access this website. I can't access this facility. I can't get through this cafeteria and so forth. And so let's get on to this topic. I prepared some slides for you today to give you a good overview. I prefer your questions and answers at the end, but you can put something in chat. And if we feel like we should just interrupt for a minute and answer that question, that's fine with me as well. I'll keep this pretty casual, and I'm wanting it to be interactive and for you to be thinking about things at your institution that might be relevant. Anytime you have an idea that piggybacks on something I'm talking about or contradicts what I'm saying, feel free to put it in chat and let the other participants know what you're interested in or something you have to offer or a resource that can be beneficial. So looking ahead now to the next slide, there are two basic approaches to access that we employ in the projects that I've directed over the years. We often work with students with disabilities, and we're working with the students themselves where we're promoting self-determination so that they're well prepared to live in a world that isn't totally accessible to them. And so getting the resources that they need, the skills that they need to ask for what they need, that's really important. We're not talking about that today. And that's a very important thing for others to be working on or me to be working on in a different context. But the other part of it is, what can the institution do? What can housing and food services and all these different services that are provided do to make things more inclusive of students with disabilities who may or may not be very well self-determined? So when I'm working with faculty and staff and institutions, campus units like yours, technology companies and technology used at post-secondary institutions, companies and so forth, Now we're talking about universal design. So it has a real broad application, but you'll find that universal design is often applied in little different groups, like universal design of learning for designing pedagogy and curriculum materials, and universal design of physical spaces, and universal design of technology. Often those are three different groups, for example, that don't talk to each other very much. But I like to talk to all of them and see how it all blends together. So what I think is we need a paradigm shift from excluding groups of people who should be able to participate in making it more inclusive. So rather than just think, well, we don't really know much about people who have blindness or people who are deaf or have mobility impairments. We don't really know a lot about that. So we're not going to deal with it. But I think we need to deal with that. We need to think about that and draw on resources as necessary to make things happen. Paradigm shift from the design for the average student or average participant to design for everyone. And from a reactive reliance on accommodations alone to a proactive, universal design of accessible, inclusive, and sustainable products, environments, and services. By sustainable, when you talk about universal design, it means you fix something and then it's there permanently. You don't have to go around it and come up with accommodations for specific students afterwards. And notice I say accommodations alone. Accommodations will always be necessary. If you apply universal design, you'll minimize the need for accommodations, not because they're bad, but they're used too often. That often we could just fix the environment, fix the documents, fix the websites and so forth, fix the presentations, so we wouldn't have to have students with disabilities and others ask for accommodations. So once upon a time, good for us, we already did this many years ago. Here's a picture of an image that was in the front page of the Daily, which is the student newspaper here at the University of Washington to this day. 1970. The headline says, "Ramp the Curbs." And it says that forging a stream of humanity, this silent protester carries his campaign on his back. His goal, to end high-rise sidewalks. And in this image, you'll see a person using a wheelchair. We see the back of his wheelchair, and he's in a crowd of students, probably going between classes at the University of Washington. And what it says on his back is it says, "Ramp the curbs, get me off the street," all in capital letters, which means he's shouting. And so he and many others back in the 70s protested about the inaccessibility of post-secondary campuses. The University of Washington and other schools at the time said, well, that's a nice thing to do, but really, how many students in wheelchairs do we really have here? And how expensive is it going to be to go out and put curb cuts on all of those sidewalks, so he can get up on the sidewalks rather than wander around the streets on campus? Well, I think we can all fast forward and realize that today, putting curb cuts in sidewalks is just standard practice in sidewalk design. I think if you went into a new housing area where they just developed a lot of houses and they have sidewalks and there weren't curb cuts, there would be many people that would complain about that. We need curb cuts for people pushing baby strollers and delivery carts, people that just have difficulty handling stairs and so forth. And so it's just good practice. And so now sometimes you'll notice that they have even some tactile bumps on those curb cuts. So they even benefit people who are using canes because of blindness, and so they can get a little bit of a warning of that they're entering the street. So universal design application has been practiced in this way and others. So applying universal design, I think there's less focus on what exactly is the diagnosis of a person. We shouldn't have to focus on that. What's the difference between muscular dystrophy and multiple sclerosis? Uh, these diagnoses, medical personnel, disability services offices may need to pay attention to those things, but most of us aren't in positions where that's really important. Rather than look at disability, I like to look at ability. And all of us in this group and beyond have a range of abilities. For example, on this diagram, I have a double-edged arrow. On the left, it's not able, 0, not able to do something. On the right, it's you're able to do something and really, really well. So then I have different characteristics that represent abilities. For instance, the ability to understand English. You might rate yourself low in that category because why? Because you might have a learning disability, or maybe English is your second language, or for some other reason. And so it may be a disability related thing, but it does indicate your ability in that characteristic. Could be disability related, maybe not. Same in understanding social norms. When you think of disabilities, sometimes we can think of conditions like autism. People on the autism spectrum sometimes have difficulty understanding social norms. And so that might be someone would in that category might rate themselves low as far as understanding social norms. It might be because they weren't born in this country and they just are kind of confused about the culture here. And so it's not necessarily a disability thing when you're talking about ability. We all could rate ourselves, and I don't think the one person in this group today would have exactly the same rating as everybody else or anybody else in this group. So we rate ourselves in the ability to see. As I mentioned, you might not be able to see this presentation. It has nothing to do with being blind. It has to do with the environment that you're in right this minute. The ability to hear, to walk, to read print, to write with a pen or a pencil, to communicate verbally, to tune out distraction. There we can look at, well, disability might be related to ADHD, attention deficit disorder, where sometimes it's difficult to tune out distraction. But all of us have a range of abilities in that area. I'm really good at tuning out distraction to almost almost a fault, in that my husband can startle me very easily by just walking up, even if we've been in the same room for hours. So I've learned to learn, I've said that, well, that's a strength of mine. I can tune out distraction and pay attention to what I'm doing. Other people would call it something else, including my husband. The ability to learn, the ability to manage physical and mental health. And we could go on and on and on of all these abilities we have and rate ourselves on our ability level. But I think that's a better way to think about different abilities and disabilities when we're designing anything. If we take a look at races and ethnicities, gender identities, um, disabilities, other characteristics, one thing to think about too is that they're not obvious. There are three images on the screen right now. All of these students are engaged with us and they all have disabilities, but you wouldn't recognize that from the images that they project. So we can't assume we know who is in our program, even in a dorm situation. Someone might not disclose their disability if they don't feel that they need an accommodation. So you may not know. So that's good to remember. Also, we need to consider intersectionality. Some people are more self-determined and they have more skills in dealing with their disability because of the school district they went to, because of the community they're in, because of the family that they're in. And so that really impacts their abilities in a serious way as well. Race, ethnicity, other things can interact with disability, multiple disabilities. People might be deaf and blind. They might have a mobility impairment and a learning disability. So we can't put people in isolated little categories. Many students with disabilities do not even disclose them. Most of them don't actually at post-secondary institutions. Why? Well, I can't tell you. You'd have to ask somebody with a disability why they didn't disclose. But I've interacted with a lot of people with disabilities, and here are some of their reasons. It's, well, I don't think I need an accommodation. Or I got accommodations in high school and I'm just kind of tired with it. I just think I want to just try and see how I can do in college. Or they might be worried about what a faculty member, oh, I'm in college now. I don't want the faculty member to know I have a disability because they may not take me seriously as a student. So there are all kinds of reasons why that's true. But the thing for us to know is you don't know if a person with a disability is in your facility or your program because they may not disclose it. And then the last one I already mentioned, that campuses primarily offer accommodations to individuals with disabilities after an inaccessibility is discovered. So we have our disability services offices that provide these accommodations, and the Americans with Disabilities Act requires that we do that. So what are some of the accommodations a person with a disability might have? Well, a common one, especially these days when we have so many electronic communications and courses, is reformatting inaccessible documents. So a person might encounter an inaccessible PDF document. They might be blind, they're using a screen reader to read text on the screen, but that document might just be scanned in. And so the screen reader can't read the text because what you're seeing there isn't really text. It's an image of text, and the screen reader just says image. Okay, so those have to be reformatted in a disability services office, perhaps, so that they can get access to the text on the screen. This is also an issue for persons who have disabilities that affect their reading ability. They too use technology that is text to speech, which reads the text on the screen, because reading can be more effective for them if they can hear the words as well as see them. And so they would have to have them reformatted. Captioning videos, even with YouTube videos, we know those captions are often created by computers and they're not edited, and so they need to be recaptioned, or at least the captions need to be edited for a person who really relies on them, like a person who's deaf. Modifying physical spaces that are not accessible, providing assistive technology that they can connect to computers. If you happen to have computers at a dorm, for example, that are public access, if you have a student with a disability, they might need assistive technology to access that. And arranging for a sign language interpreter. Of all of these things, the last two you might have to have be reactive for when people request an assistive technology device or people need a sign language interpreter. But the first three, we have to kind of question. Why don't we make our documents accessible to begin with, born accessible? Why don't we caption our videos accurately? Like maybe a description of the dorm to take someone on a tour of the dorm using a video. Why don't make sure those captions are clear and accurate? And modifying physical spaces. Could we modify them so that they would be accessible to the next person that comes along? So we could do some proactive things. So let's define universal design. There are multiple definitions. This is the original one that comes from the Center for Universal Design. The design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible, and you could even maybe say and reasonable, without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So what can we do to make a product more inclusive of everybody without having to provide very many accommodations, without ruling them out, by the way? We always have to be aware we might have to accommodate someone. On the screen right now, there's an image of a name tag. Back in the day when we used to go do a lot of conferences on site, more of them are online, but some on site these days, we set about my staff to design a universally designed name tag. And so what you see here is you see a lanyard. A lot of people like lanyards when they go to conferences. I'm not one of them, by the way, because it makes your name so far below. I like my name tag to be up by my face, and other people so I can figure out what their name is without looking so low on their body. Okay, so this has a lanyard, and then it is connected to a plastic container, and then it has a name on it, Cheryl, very large, and my last name, and then my title. But if you notice some details about this, the lanyard is not permanently affixed to that name tag. So someone like me, I don't really want to use lanyard. I can clip that off because the clip is on the plastic name tag holder. You'd also notice that that clip has a safety pin through it. So at a conference, I could take my name tag and I could clip it to my collar. If I'm wearing maybe a sweater with no collar, then I might use a pin. And so I can make a choice. And it's not like providing three different options to someone. It's the flexibility that's the universal design characteristic. So if I'm going to a conference, I might want to clip it to my collar one day and use the pin the next day, or maybe even a lanyard. But anyway, you make personal choice. And so the flexibility is built into the product. You don't just provide multiple products. So if you take a look at a website and universally designing it, you make it flexible so everyone can use that website rather than maybe a special website for people with disabilities. The universal design characteristics that we look for is something that is technically accessible to a person with disabilities that might be using assistive technology or whatever, like a screen reader, and it has to be technically accessible, but also usable. Because some products are technically accessible, but they're really hard for someone to navigate who's using assistive technology. So it has to be usable too by that person. And then inclusive, as I mentioned, you have products that are flexible, so everybody's using the same product as much as possible. Just to emphasize what I mean by inclusive access, we can look at access to buildings. These are two buildings on our campus here at the University of Washington. And the first image is a building, a fairly new building actually, that has kind of a standard entrance. You go in the main entrance, there are two steps into the main two doors. And then you look to the left, there's a nice ramp. It's a very shallow ramp, so I'm sure it's ADA compliant. It has some handrails that a person can use as well to get up to the top. That is an ADA accessible product and a way to get into that building that's very functional. But if you look to the right, this is actually an older building. But in this building, the main entrance is the ramp. And so a person can go down this ramp. It's a shallow ramp. Also notice that ramp is really wide. And so I could be walking side by side with a wheelchair user, and we could continue our conversation and go in the same way. If I was going into the building at the left, I probably would we would probably part ways because I couldn't go side by side. The ramp isn't wide enough. And it's kind of odd to walk in front of somebody or behind somebody in a wheelchair. And so I'd probably take the steps. And so the second one is not only accessible, very usable, just like the first one, but it's also inclusive. This cartoon gives a good representation of what that means. We have a picture here of a man that's shoveling off some steps going into a building. There's a ramp on the left-hand side, similar to the entrance of the other building that I mentioned, the university. And when I look at what's happening here, there's a young man in a wheelchair, and he says, and the man is shoveling off the steps, and the one in the wheelchair says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And this man says, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you." And then the young man in the wheelchair, who's self-determined, by the way, says, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." And it's looking for that inclusiveness. What everybody can use. We don't say we don't want to have steps. It's fine to have steps. That it's just whenever possible, make the main entrance have the most accessible one. So let's look at a framework for universal design. I've written a book on this, and so this is just a quick outline of what aspects there are that are in the framework. We can look at the scope, like what are we talking about? There's a definition I already gave you, but there are also a lot of principles and guidelines and practices and process that we'll talk about. If you look at the scope, we talk about students. They're diverse with respect to race, ethnicity, cultural background, gender identity, socioeconomic level, age, marital status, religious beliefs, values, academic interests, specific abilities. I put this list here because we want to consider all those categories, even though I'm focusing on abilities for this particular talk. So that's who we're talking about and the diversity in that group. And then it's the application areas. Sometimes you apply universal design to all applications in educational offerings. Or you might want to apply it to instruction, maybe even more specifically to online learning, or to services, or to programs, projects. You can even design a conference that's universally designed. Presentations like the one I'm giving today, and then housing practices, our focus today, and on and on and on. Housing practices is a good example, as I mentioned earlier, because it applies a lot of the principles of universal design. So which of these application areas for universal design are relevant to your unit? You might want to put this in chat and look at these 4 things. I came up with these 4 categories as being relevant to education. And there are also, you could add more, but the 4 of them cover most of the things that we do in education: instruction, services, information technology, physical spaces. And then I've created some checklists that you'll find on the website that I'll give you access to at the end. Instruction, we think about things like class climate, interaction. What about the physical environment we're using and the products, maybe our learning management system, our delivery methods, the technology we're using, the feedback we give students in assessment, and accommodation. Then accommodations on the end, because you're always going to need to provide accommodations upon request. And then services. What do we think about when we're offering services? Planning and policies, evaluation of methods. Do we deal with abilities on that? The physical environment again, the staff, are staff well-trained? Information resources, the events that you're offering. And then IT. We talk about procurement and development policies and so forth. And physical spaces, we'll talk more about that. But planning and policies again, evaluation, the appearance of the space. We want to universally design it, but we want the appearance to be what we want it to be. Looking at entrances, we talked about that a little bit. Routes of travel. Sometimes the accessible entrance is in the back of a building and there's no sign to say where it is. The fixtures, the furniture, information resources, and we always have to think about safety as well, and again, accommodations. So if we look at technology, there are actually 2 things we think about. One is technology builds in accessibility features. There's a good example in the smartphones that we use. Notice you can have a white on black screen, black on white. You can adjust for the color, the room that you're in, whether it's dark or it's light. And we can actually have our phones talk to us. Mine does a little bit more than I'd like actually sometimes. But anyway, these are all accessibility features that used to be assistive technology, but now they're built into phones and other technologies as well. But that's a good example of that built-in accessibility as much as possible. And then we want to ensure compatibility with assistive technology. So I mentioned screen readers before, but there are also a lot of alternative keyboards and other technologies that are very cool, but we want to make sure our technology can also interface with those so that we don't create a block for people with disabilities who are using them. I mentioned videos before, and as with other universal design, applying universal design by having those accurate captions benefits a lot of people besides those who can't hear the video or the audio. English language learners, as I mentioned, but it might be somebody in a noisy environment like the airport or a noiseless one like a library. They can benefit from captions. I like to watch YouTube videos sometimes when I'm watching TV, half watching TV when my husband's in the room, and I can turn on the captions and turn off the sound, and I can kind of keep my eye on both things that are going on. Especially if it's a sports game, I can kind of find plenty of time to watch my video. Those who have slow internet connections, who want to know the spelling of words, a lot of us want to know the spelling of words, and those who want to find the content quickly. There are ways to search captions to find content we're looking for in a collection of videos. So I mentioned that we have principles for universal design, and there are really three sets that I think apply to this group that I'm talking to today. There are 7 principles of universal design that go along with that definition that I gave you from the Center on Universal Design, like even having uh, space in a physical space for approach. So someone in a wheelchair has enough room to maneuver, but also making things accessible to left and right-handed users. And those are disabilities, but again, universal design goes beyond that. And built on those 7 principles, people have come up with specialized principles for particular applications. And the 2 most relevant to this audience today are universal design for learning. That kind of has to do with information resources, training resources, online education, and so forth. And there are 3 principles for universal design for learning. And then there are 4 principles that underpin the web content accessibility guidelines that help you design a website and other IT so it's accessible and inclusive of people with disabilities. I'm not going to go through all these today. Thank you. You're welcome. Yeah, but I'm going to kind of give my summary that kind of is the gist of these 14 principles. In a nutshell, we provide multiple ways for participants to learn. That could be offering a video of your program in your facility or a program, but also maybe having written materials as well, multiple ways for people to get the information. Multiple ways to demonstrate what they have learned, particularly in a class, for instance, and evaluation and assessment, and different ways to engage, maybe one-on-one, maybe online. People have different preferences, and can we give them their preferences, consider them when we engage with them. But then the second one is really important too. In all of what we do, we make sure that the technologies we're using, the facilities, the services, the resources, and the strategies that we're using are accessible to individuals with a wide variety of disabilities, or we could say a wide variety of abilities. So that's what universal design is, as far as kind of the basic principles, basic guidelines, and what we're trying to accomplish. And we're not going to go into great detail. But let's look again at my presentation today. I'm using Microsoft PowerPoint. I'm using actually a template in PowerPoint because Microsoft does a good job of creating templates that kind of push you in the direction of accessibility. It also has a really good accessibility checker. And so I put my presentation through the checker to make sure that I have made my presentation accessible. Google Slides, for example, doesn't have an accessibility checker. And so I picked a tool that will help me make my product accessible. You can get access to these slides after the presentation. And so you might even want to look at, do an accessibility check on my slides and see if I missed anything. So for example, using a text format, this is not, this slide doesn't have like a screen image or something that I put on here. These are real text, these are text letters, they're not images of letters. Structuring headings and lists and tables using the formatting tools in PowerPoint is what I would do. Then I make sure that my slides are uncluttered. You can see they're kind of simple, not real exciting maybe, but I don't have cluttered backgrounds. I don't have things that are going to be distracting to some people, for instance, who have difficulty paying attention, but also lots of contrast to make sure that people with visual impairments can access the content. And spelling out acronyms. I had spelled out universal design the first time, example, and explaining jargon. I'm trying to avoid a lot of jargon that I don't think is necessary today. And then speaking the critical content presented in the slides. Those are just a few things that I'm doing today. There's a document that I created in my organization. And I'll give you where you can find it at the very end. But it's called Equal Access: Universal Design of Housing and Residential Life. And it has a checklist in it. And so I'm going to just give you a little bit of content from that document, and you can get a lot more by looking at it later. So what facilities and programs are we considering here in this document? Well, single student residence halls and apartments, family housing. Remember, it might not be the student that has a disability. It might be a child of that student or a spouse of that student. Um, Making sure the academic theme and special interest houses are accessible and inclusive. Even off-campus housing rentals. Some people are shocked by this, that if you're renting space, you still have the obligation of making it accessible to people with disabilities. The people that rented to you are not at fault, or they're not legally obligated. It's you that provides that space for a person with a disability, and you're the one that chose that rental. And so you should have maybe some information in your contracts on what you expect about the accessibility of rentals that you choose to use. But even things like cafeterias and meeting rooms, common areas, computer labs, restrooms, recreational facilities, and so forth, and all programs that might be offered in your facility. So whom are we considering? So people with disabilities who live in the facilities, of course, but we go beyond that. People who live there have friends, family, visitors. All of them might have disabilities. So we have to make it accessible, a certain level of accessibility in all of our facilities, because we don't know who might be showing up. That's that universal design attitude. Prospective students, parents, and other visitors who go on tours. That's what we do on our campus. I assume that you might do that. So people that just might show up unannounced that they have a disability. So thinking, are you taking them down accessible routes of travel and so forth? Newly admitted students who are participating in a stayover program to orient them to campus life. I remember I did that before I went to a college. And there were a lot of students. We stayed overnight and had a great time. But that you need to make sure is accessible. And when you offer those programs, to make sure you've told the people that are signing up how they can request accommodations. That statement is really important. So you do get some warning if they might need some special things. But again, you want to make it accessible as possible from the get-go. Individuals residing in campus facilities as part of a summer conference, workshops, or camps. I mentioned the Do It program that I founded. We have a summer program that still is going on for teens with disabilities who are in high school, that are thinking of going to college, and they live in the dormitory. And so we had to make some renovations to these dormitories to make them accessible to the wide variety of abilities that these students have. So all those things are worth thinking about. And if you think about them proactively, then maybe you won't have to do a lot of retroactive refitting. So one broad category is planning and policies and evaluation. A few things that are on this checklist I mentioned, to include the inclusion of people with disabilities, is that are people with diverse abilities represented in your planning, review process, and advisory committees? Um, Keep in mind that if you have one person with a disability, they're not necessarily going to know about all kinds of disabilities, but you might have in your advisory committee someone from the Disability Services Office who has a broad knowledge about disability, but then have a person with a disability as well, to represent that group to some degree. Is accessibility considered in procurement processes? When you're buying furniture, when you're buying, computer stations and so forth, or whatever you're buying, do you have accessibility considered in that process? Do you make clear to residents and staff how to make or address requests for disability-related accommodations regarding the facilities and the offerings? Do you have a policy on service animals? You should consult with your Disability Services Office to see what the campus policy on that, so that you apply that policy. Because I know specific cases where dormitories have refused to have someone have a service animal without consulting disability services. And you generally, I think in most campuses, do need to include them, and there are specific parameters around that. And personal care assistants, someone who needs a personal care assistant, maybe to come in the morning and help them get ready for school, and maybe coming in the evening and getting them ready for bed, and so forth. How do we, what how do you deal with that? Thinking about it ahead of time with the guidance from disability services, but also someone that maybe has a personal care assistant. What would that entail? What are things we need to think about? You don't have to have the answers, but it's important that you ask the questions and have some idea what might come up. And what are disability related access issues addressed in evaluations? Sometimes we'll have these evaluations of our programs, and we give them to the people that are involved in them. But in the case of disabilities, sometimes they're few and far between, and so we might have to have someone do an evaluation that maybe isn't in all of those programs, but can give you some guidance to fill out an evaluation, uh, to think about what you're doing. We used to put panels together when I was directing our program in new facilities, get together maybe 5 or 6 students with disabilities, different types of disabilities, to give feedback on facility design and program design to the organizers. And that was very useful. And they were the architects in our cases, very open to these considerations. And it wouldn't usually involve major changes, but some changes that were very important, like even the floor surfaces that could be more useful, accessible for someone using a wheelchair. And then you look at your physical environment, of course, and the products in there. Do you address disability access issues for new housing construction and renovations? Um, some things that our students have come up with, one of them in one facility, they put the button for opening the door too close to the door. And so he says, well, now if I push this button to open the door, I have to quickly roll back in my wheelchair or it's going to hit me. Things like that. And it helps to have people with disabilities involved in that. Is at least part of a counter service desk at a height accessible from a seated position? In our office at the university, we have, modular office counter. And so we have half of it that's stand-up height, standard height, and the other is wheelchair height, so seated height. We would have a chair there. So if someone wants to sit down and talk to the person behind the counter, they can. It also makes it nice because some of the people at that counter, servicing that counter, are wheelchair users themselves, and so they can't stand up to service someone. Are there clearly identified wheelchair accessible exterior internal routes of travel and restrooms and elevator controls? So look at your signage and besides the accessibility aspect, but how can people figure out where to go? People in wheelchairs or walkers often will tell me things like, well, I have to wander around this building to figure out. It's kind of exhausting when you're a wheelchair user and a walker user. And so, kind of think about that. Are aisles kept wide and clear of obstructions for the safety of people who have mobility or visual impairments? Sometimes in computer labs, that's not the case, and staff are not well prepared and they just kind of stack up some boxes here and there and don't think too much of it. Staff, do staff know what to do? Is the housing webmaster knowledgeable about accessible web design? There are a lot of training materials for learning about that, but have the people that this person reports to told that person that they expect them to learn about accessible web design and apply some practices as their skills increase. And they'll find a community of people on campus that can help them with that. Usually a special interest group of some sort or a central group that can help them get started. And do housing staff receive training about how to respond to requests for accommodations and to communicate with individuals who have disabilities? On the back of the handout that I'm talking about here, there's a whole list of communication tips. And one of them is, for instance, avoiding negative descriptions of disabilities, like people that are confined to a wheelchair. I've known a lot of people who use wheelchairs. I've never met one that's confined to one. In fact, they all get out of them at times, and they're not confined. They're actually liberated by this wonderful assistive technology called a wheelchair. It gets them around. It lets them do things that they couldn't do otherwise. So think about not using a negative tone, but also when you're a person's using a sign language interpreter, uh, make eye contact with the person. And sometimes that takes a little bit of, discipline because you're tempted to look at or look at the sign language interpreter who's speaking, but you should be looking to the person, and that person can still be responding with their description. And do they know how to request for these accommodations too? And a lot of it is just don't say no, like the service animal thing. And somebody says, well, I have a service animal. How, are you allowed to have one? Make sure your staff are careful not to say no. Say, let me check on that for you. And so they come up with the right answer. And they're welcoming to people with disabilities, even though they may not know exactly what can happen. Your information resources and your technology, caption videos, of course. If you offer computer systems, even a few in your lobby, then you need to have procedures for requesting assistive technology. If you don't need to provide that. If they're only having their own technology, then they're required, or they have to provide their own assistive technology. So you don't have to worry about personal ownership of equipment. But the public, you have to think about that when you put those public systems out there. And a lot of times, just an announcement, just a label on there saying, if you need assistive technology, please contact so and so, and then you work that out. Do pictures in publications and websites include people with disabilities? And so people with disabilities know that they're welcome. Do electronic documents and web pages adhere to accessibility guidelines and standards? Well, back to training staff on that. And are publications available in alternative formats, for instance, in Braille, if someone wants to do that? Do you know how to do that? Or do you know who to talk to get that done? And then again, looking at evaluation, in this case, the emergency evacuation processes. This is really important. Are there effective procedures related to emergencies for people with disabilities? Think about your rules in emergency evacuation that might be on the backs of the dorm room doors, for example. What if a person has a different type of disability? What is the direction for them? Do you provide training to all residents and staff regarding evacuation procedures, including those for people with disabilities? Because remember, even if you don't have a disability yourself, your brother might be visiting you and he has a disability. So do you know what to do? And do staff consult with residents who have disclosed disabilities? So they've already disclosed, do they have a disability, to learn about their preferences? For one thing, you can learn about that, and maybe you can revise your practices to be more specific. People that from the fire department and other emergency people can also provide you some ideas, and the Disability Services Office as well. Then there are these events like the one today, and some in person, of course. Are they located in wheelchair accessible facilities? Again, if you might want to locate them somewhere else, maybe you have an event that's located in a different facility, maybe you've even rented it, you're still responsible to make sure that it's accessible. And are accessible entrances and exits clearly marked? Is information about how to request disability accommodations included in the promotional materials? That's a welcoming statement to a person with disability, by the way. You say, we're going to have this program, da 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 da. At the end, it says, if you'd like to request accommodations, contact. And it's usually best, I think, to have them contact someone in your unit. And so go to somebody that's responsible for a prompt response to that message. And they know what they need to do and when they need to consult disability services and so forth. Make that transparent for the person requesting the accommodation. And accessible transportation. Only if you're arranging transportation for other participants, but once you do, then if a person needs accessible transportation, like a wheelchair accessible van, then you need to arrange for that as well. Couple things to think about, 3 things. Nothing about us without us. I've mentioned this a few times, but making sure that you include people with disabilities in the things you're doing. Even if you can't include a lot of them, include some of them. That's really important. But also, there's a little caution there. When you meet a person with autism, you've met one individual with autism. This is a quote by Dr. Stephen Shore, and I really agree with it wholeheartedly. Sometimes a person, you think, well, we've talked to one person who's blind, and so we know all about blindness. Well, no, 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 no. Their stories are important, but also it's important to have people that have a broad experience with people with different types of disabilities is important as well. And then work with the Disability Services Office in that regard. They do have experience. It doesn't replace the personal stories of people with disabilities, but they've heard, like I have, many of the stories of people with disabilities, and so can be useful to you as well. So when we look at universal design, it's a framework. It's an attitude. It's an attitude that you're going to be proactive. You're going to value everyone. It's a process. It promotes best practices and absolutely does not lower your standards. It's always proactive, can be implemented incrementally. Don't think that doing everything at once. If you look at the checklist that I'm referring you to, you can go through that. Some of those questions aren't relevant to what you're doing, but go through there and look at those questions and think, maybe we should think about that. Maybe we should think about that. Make yourself a list and just do a few things at a time. Should benefit everyone, or the goal is to benefit everyone. So you don't want to create barriers to some people by making something more accessible to others. And it minimizes the need for accommodations, but we still have to provide them when we're not fully accessible. This last page, I have some resources. One points to the Center for Universal Design and Education that's hosted here at the University of Washington. It provides a universal design framework. It also is where you can find the equal access universal design of housing and residential life. And the URL for that resource is uw.edu/DOIT/CUDE. And if you go to that resource, this was the Center on Universal Design and Education. If you search for that, you'll find it as well. You'll find all kinds of checklists. I don't know, over 50, I think we've come up with for different types of services, career services, universal design of technology, universal design of admissions offices, and so forth. We have found individual units like to have their own checklist, even though there's a lot of commonality, of course, between them. There's also a nice ADA checklist for readily achievable barrier removal. I like this because it's not like everything that our architect might look at, but for those of us running programs and hosting physical spaces where activities may occur, it's readily achievable stuff, things that you should think about beyond, as in your position, beyond maybe what architects or other people might think about. And that's at ada.gov. So Americans with Disabilities Act.gov. They have other resources, by the way, as well. But ada.gov/checkweb.htm. And I'm Cheryl Bergstaller, and I'll read my email address. And that means you can contact me, Cheryl Bergstaller at outlook.edu. Oops, that's supposed to be calm. That's supposed to be calm. I'll fix that before I'll share these PowerPoints. So the book that I wrote is called Creating Inclusive Learning Opportunities in Higher Education, a Universal Design Toolkit. And now we're at the point where you can ask questions, a summary of what I've just talked about. You can put those in the chat, by the way. But a summary of kind of what we talked about, kind of where we started is barriers that we've created, the accommodation model, which there's nothing wrong with accommodations. It's just that we apply them too often to provide access solutions, and how universal design is the proactive part, but it also includes accommodations as necessary. And then that whole framework includes principles we can always rely on and guidelines, but also specific practices. And these checklists we've created in my organization, the Do It Center, have been created with people like you that have reviewed them and edited them. And if you'll notice at the end of these publications, they said, if you have more ideas, send them to so-and-so. And so they're works in progress. But they kind of guide you, kind of think about some of these things. And so that kind of is the most I have to say then about applying universal design and your programs.
Looks like, Cheryl, we might have one question. Feel
Okay.
free to also raise your digital hand and we can unmute you and allow you to verbally ask that question if you'd rather not put it in the chat. So I have a hand raised from Gertrude. Gertrude, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. You can feel free to ask your
Hello,
question.
Gertrude.
All right. Okay, Cheryl, how are you?
I'm
I
good.
yeah,
I'm good. It's a
I
nice
don't know
sunny
if
day in Seattle.
yeah, you were picking my brains. I was thinking about actually I'm thinking about a dissertation topic.
Oh, this would be a good
Yes.
dissertation topic.
Yes,
I would
I'm
even be
a
willing to
city
meet with
plan.
you on Zoom to talk about it.
Yeah, I'm a city planner by training, but right now I'm a hall director at the
Yeah,
University of Michigan in Ann Arbor.
yeah.
So I was thinking about how design kind of especially the more they build these new buildings, they look very nice, but what about the price, affordability?
Mm,
Oh, to retro, and some of the older buildings are not retrofitted with these new, I mean, they don't have elevators, they do
hmm.
not have the bathrooms don't have grab bars, a wheelchair can't go over the humps. So from a design perspective and a planning angle, I was thinking, how do you talk about that without affecting housing affordability for students in terms of designing or retrofitting older buildings? The intersectionality of price, access, and safety, because some buildings are in really horrible places, off campus housing, that used to be single
Yes.
family housing and they were converted into student housing. And I feel sorry for the kids.
Yeah.
And then you have the new ones that are really nice, but good Lord, they are very expensive. So
Hmm.
I'm talking about equity, all these things. How do you
Yeah.
balance those?
I wish I had an easy answer for you.
I know there's no easy answer. That's why I said
But
this
I
is
can say how I would approach it is
yes,
looking at you. We want to make sure you get what you know the as much as you can for the buck that you're spending. If you're like the University, we have a lot of really old stuff here at the University of Washington. You know, we were
yes,
founded before the 1900s, and so we've been around a long, long time. Very
yeah,
inaccessible. Some of our older buildings, and some of them, I
mm,
talk to people and give them advice as I walk through their buildings and say, well, let's see what are some easy things we can do.
yes,
You know, and some of it, one of them was a building that had a very inaccessible entrance, long row of steps.
yes,
And then
mm-hmm,
around the side of the building, they had an accessible entrance.
mm-hmm,
And actually, it just a matter, it was just was a matter of, and that was going in at a different floor. They did have an elevator, by the way, but it didn't go
mm,
to the top floor. But
yes,
anyway, but I said, well, what about if you make, you know, a little and make the sidewalk a little bigger going down to that other entrance and remove some bushes
mm-hmm,
and say entrance and
mm,
put an arrow. People can still walk in up the steps. You're not saying you can't go in this way, but a big sign that says this is the entrance and then they can go around, but it's the wheelchair accessible entrance.
yes,
And then in the back there, they had a bunch of garage, they had a bunch of garbage cans and stuff
mm-hmm,
by that accessible entrance. And I said, well, how about if you move these a little bit over here and we
okay,
just kind of make this entrance a little bit more welcoming. And they
mm-hmm,
actually put some a bush on each side of the entrance. And so it just
okay,
looked like more like an entrance. Okay, so I thought that was a step
okay,
to send a message. They
mm-hmm,
also had some activities they offered on the top floor, and so people couldn't get up there if they couldn't use the elevator. And a lot of them
mm-hmm,
were student activities, where a lot of interaction with the students was happening up there. It's kind of where they
mm-hmm,
hung out. So yeah, that's
mm,
really a disadvantage. This was an academic building, by the way, not a residence hall, but that's kind of a disadvantage when your students can't network with each other.
yeah,
So I'm actually not sure if they made this change, but I suggested that they put that on a different floor and maybe move the offices of some people that don't interact much with students, more the administrative things up on that top floor. And so
mm-hmm,
now you're still going to run into a problem if you have an administrator who needs an elevator, but that
mm,
reduces the chance that that's going to happen. And then you can make accommodations for that one person or something. So kind of going through one thing at a time and thinking, well,
yes,
let's see, could we do something that would just help this a little bit? And a lot of times
yes,
I find the signage is very helpful because people just sometimes they're
definitely,
just darn mad because they don't even tell you that it's an inaccessible way to go, and they're already there, wondering what they
yes,
do next.
mm, yes. Oh, yeah, that's very helpful. And we have been researching and researching,
Yeah,
copying and pasting. Then I saw this, it came up in my feed,
yeah.
I
Well,
clicked.
what I like to say is progress before
Mm.
perfection.
Yes, I agree.
That we're in progress before perfection. Perfection we can kind of shoot for when it's a new building,
Yes.
and they are awfully expensive, by the way, but
Oh,
still,
yes.
that's the time where we can really get in there and
Yeah.
hopefully implement change. Get on the advisory board for that and help get students involved and so forth.
Yes.
But
Yes. Yes.
progress on these older buildings, they're not going to go away.
No, they are not. We have quite a few here, but we also have the new buildings, which are very nice and they are very expensive. And
Yep.
I was looking at the pricing, and
Yeah.
with university education being so expensive at this
Yeah.
point, I really was looking at we talk
Yeah.
about housing affordability for the
Yeah.
general population.
Yeah.
What about
And maybe
student housing?
And maybe
So
in those cases, you might
mm,
look at a residence hall too and look at the first floor and see, is
yes,
there something we can do to make that more
yes,
accessible?
yes,
Even if they have an elevator, by the way, but just focusing on the first, because that solves some of the emergency exit issues as well.
yes, yes,
And so think, well, what can we do here? And maybe could we get a few rooms that are
yes,
better? That's
yeah,
not what we'd like
yeah,
ultimately, but that's
yeah,
progress, really good progress.
yeah. Oh,
Thanks for
yes, yes.
your question, Gertrude.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. So,
I
yeah, I've been researching and thinking, one building doesn't have elevators, has very narrow, but it's one of the oldest buildings. It's 103 years old. It keeps on flooding because it seems to be sinking, all these things. That is a case study, but it's full of students. And so all these different moving parts, as Americans say. So yeah, that's where I am.
All right. Are there any other questions for Cheryl?
Yeah, I like this comment from Molly.
Mhm.
In my institution, if a student must be assigned to a specific building due to an accommodation and that building normally costs more, we do not charge them additional fees since it's due to the ADA accommodation. Great example. Some students too, if they need, maybe because they just need more space, and they can't be accommodated very well with it if they have a roommate, and so they might get a private room, but they don't. If you consider it an accommodation, then you can justify not charging them extra for that.
Yes, that's actually a kind of a fair housing area, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, I suppose.
As it
Yeah,
relates
yeah,
to
yeah.
staying in compliance with fair housing, which is a whole nother webinar for another day.
Oh,
But
another webinar, yeah.
yes, let's
But
keep that in
certainly
mind.
intersection between the two.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right.
So thanks, Molly, for that example.
Yeah. Well, if there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget, we've got more coming up even before this month is over. On Friday, we'll be doing a session all about harnessing the power of AI while
Ah,
keeping housing human. So we hope you'll join us for that on Friday. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Cheryl.